Hello, everyone, and welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the RAF Bomber Command podcast with me, Jane Gulliford-Lowes, and my co-host, James Jeffries. Today, we've got a very mixed bag of bits and pieces for you. We're going to be attempting to answer some of your questions. Massive thanks to everyone who's been sending them in. Please keep doing so. And we love receiving all your comments, questions and queries and try to answer as many of them as we can. Although I have to say some of them we really do struggle with. A big thank you to everyone who joined our live stream last weekend too. So what have you been up to, James? Anything exciting in the last week?
It's all been about moving house, to be honest, and all of the fun that comes with that and boxes. And yeah, I've been without a desk for a little while. So yeah, work's been a little bit chaotic. I've been going onto campus to do it. And I mean, the other thing is I don't have a place to do any airfix kits, and I'm desperate to get back to making my kits, especially now that I found out that Trumpeter are doing a 1/48 scale fairy battle, which I'm very excited about. Yeah, so it's going to be the Avro Anson next, and then I'm going to do the fairy battle at some point. But yeah,
I need to make a start on my Halifax, which I have a feeling is going to be absolutely enormous. Yeah. But bear in mind, I have no clue what I'm doing, and I don't have any glue, and I don't have any paint. And I've just kind of realised, because I'm so dumb and not used to doing this kind of thing, that you've actually got to build it from the inside out, which had never occurred to me.
Yeah. You got to make decisions like, you're going to have the crew in it and such like. Yeah. Or you're going to have the wheels down, wheels up. Yeah.
Novice at this sort of thing. And also what's been happening, I'm just working really hard as well at the moment in the new job, which is going really well. I'm actually starting to really enjoy it, so that's good. Yeah, I keep being invited to things that I can't attend as well. I mean, like film premieres and stuff, because they're all in London.
Yeah.
And I've just been invited to give a talk on the South Coast, but it was on a Wednesday afternoon in Kent. And I can't get to Kent for a Wednesday.
Oh, crikey.
It would be like a 700-mile round trip for me. So yeah, that's not good, sadly. I have asked them if we can do it by Zoom, but I don't know. We'll see. Anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It all happens down south, doesn't it?
Well, I know. I'm just in the... I know if I live in the sticks.
Now, before we get on to the Q&A part of the show, we're going to be discussing the experiences of a mostly Canadian crew and a story which I know is very close to Jane's heart. More than 1/4 of Bomber Command aircrew were Canadians. Hundreds of Canadians were already serving with RAF Bomber Command at the outbreak of the war, with tens of thousands more volunteering throughout the course of the war. In addition, through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, 31,000 aircrew of all nationalities were trained in Canada. We're going to be talking about one of those men in today's episode and about training for RAF Bomber Command in general. So, Jane, can you outline what Bomber Command volunteers could expect in terms of the structure of their training?
Yeah, I'll just go into this kind of pretty briefly, really, before we get onto the story of this particular crew. So on your aircraft, you've got a number of different men, all with different roles. And each of those different roles require trade training. So by that, I mean, obviously, a pilot is going to learn to fly the aircraft. A navigator has to learn navigational skills. Wireless operator's got to learn all of his wireless drill, his Morse code, and all his technical electronic stuff. Bombing has got to do all of his lot of trigonometry and all of that sort of thing. Gunners, gunnery training, etc. Flight engineers basically got to learn how to do everything. So training for these trades, if you like, are undergone separately in separate training schools. Some of them in the UK, some of them abroad. And then once a man has completed his trade training, then he will be sent to what was called operational training units. Now, I'll not go into the complicated structure of how these were actually formed, because some were originally attached to the different squadrons, but then they were sort of moved on to and run separately from the operational squadrons. But the purposes of an operational training unit was to form crews and to train them how to fly aircraft together. So you're basically bringing together all of those different trades that we've just been talking about into a cohesive unit, into a team, so that they can then fly an aircraft operationally. And there were several OTUs up and down the country. There, the crews would start off on sort of smaller aircraft and then gradually move on to sort of bigger and bigger and bigger ones. And so you're looking at things like Whitleys were very popular. Basically, anything that was ancient and clapped out and wasn't particularly necessary for carrying out the strategic bombing campaign or bombing raids over Germany. So, and because many of these aircraft were so old and so clapped out, there was a lot of accidents, huge amount of accidents in training. And once they'd completed their operational training, they would then move on to the heavy conversion unit. So that's where you basically learn how to fly your 4-engine heavies, your Halifaxes or your Lancaster. They come sort of a little bit later on, if you like. Do you want to add in anything there, James?
Well, what you say about the accidents and such like there, they were in the absolute clapped out aircraft that, if Coastal Command didn't get it, it would go to the OTUs. And 10% of Bomber Command's losses come during training, which is about 5,000 fatalities. Says a lot, doesn't it? And an element of that has to do with the fact that they were flying these bombers that had seen service and had been patched up and were, clapped out, as you say. And also the other thing to mention is with OTUs, it wasn't just Bomber Command. You had Fighter Command with operational training units and such like as well, which I think is worth mentioning here.
Yeah. Quick mention about crewing up as well. So what is crewing up? This is because the RAF didn't allocate men to particular crews within Bomber Command. They were basically just told to form themselves into crews. So what would happen is that an arrival at the OTU, they would all be sent off to the hangar for a cup of tea and a biscuit or whatever, and told to sort of mingle among themselves and form themselves into crew, so that people kind of naturally gravitated together. So perhaps you would get your eye on someone who you knew from one of the trade schools or something like that, or who you'd done part of your training with. That's how crews were formed. I think there's a really good example of this if people want to listen to episode 3 when we interviewed Tom Davidson, our Halifax flight engineer, and he talks about how he got his eye on the pilot Pat, and he was saying, "Oh, hope he picks me, and he did. And it was just a very sort of laid back, casual way of going about the whole process, but it seemed to work. So what I'm going to do is to just mention from a great little book, which is actually the Haynes Manual on Bomber Command, which was written
very useful book,
Jonathan Faulkner. If you haven't got this, it's an absolutely cracking little book. It's not it's not like an academic book, but it's just full of really great information, fantastic photographs of original accounts, millions of facts and figures. It is a geek's paradise, basically.
It really is, yeah.
This book a lot. It's brilliant. So I'm just going to share with you an excerpt that the author Jonathan Faulkner mentions in this book. And this is from the diary of a 19-year-old flight engineer called Sergeant Les Fry. He was undergoing conversion training on Halifaxes at 1666 HCU Wombleton in the early summer of 1944. So I'm just going to quickly read his entries. This is just for the course of about a month or so. Saturday, 27th of May. We'd only been here 5 minutes when I saw the first plane I have ever seen go up in flames. It was burning for almost an hour. There were 3 flight engineers in it. One of them had his leg broken and the other his jaw. The rest of the crew got out okay. That was Halifax HR 834. Monday, 5th of June. Another kite crashed. Everyone was okay. Wednesday, 7th of June. Another kite crashed. All were killed. Halifax LW 279. Sunday, 7th of June. The kite we were on last night was lousy. We had to change kites because we had an oil leak. Wednesday, 14th of June. Tonight I did my first solo, if one can call it that. It was about 5 hours, but we had to change kites. I've not been in a kite yet, that is first class. Thursday, 22nd of June. We got about 9 hours in today and are going hard at it. I had an engine cut out on landing yesterday, but it picked up a bit when we started to level off. Friday, 23rd of June. On fighter affiliation for 4 hours this afternoon. I had the hydraulic system go US. Monday, 26th of June. They lost another kite on Saturday night. Only the first flight engineer and the tail gunner got out. The rest were killed. Halifax JD 106. So that gives you an idea as just to the numbers of crashes. That's just one guy recording the crashes at just one of the HCUs there. So yeah, it's just horrific, really, an horrific loss rate.
Yeah.
So looking at my Uncle Jack's logbook from when he was at the OTUs and the HCUs, there were things going wrong all the time for him and his crew. Constant problems with mechanics, things going wrong, things breaking. But that, I guess, is kind of the point, because you've got to learn how to adapt to these situations, because these things are going to happen when you're flying operationally, and you need to know how to cope with them. For example, if you lost an engine, if you lost two engines, they actually lost an engine on their very first stop. But because they dealt with this in training, they knew how to deal with it. And the flight engineer was able to sort it out. One of the things that really stood out for me was that when they were at the HCU, they were doing nighttime bomber training. Because obviously at this point in time, we're talking spring of 43, the vast majority of their raids, in fact, I think all of their raids would have taken place at night. And when they were converting to Halifaxes, the time that they spent on nighttime training operations before they flew their first operation was 13 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, 13 hours of nighttime bomber training in a Halifax.
That's it?
Before going to your operation, before going to your actual unit. Yeah, 13 hours.
That's
Maybe they've done some additional time, but yeah, you just can't even comprehend that, can you?
Yeah. Well, mind you, they would have learned the instruments, blind and such like, and things like that on the ground. But even so, that's still, gosh. So moving on to the trainee crew, which is really the heart of this week's episode. What made you want to tell their story, Jane? Why this crew in particular?
Well, there are a couple of reasons, really. When Jack completed his tour in March 1944, he went off to be an instructor at 19 OTU, I think it was, up at RAF at Kinloss in the far north of Scotland. He had quite a comfy rest of the war, really, compared to lots of people. He wasn't called up to do a second tour, and he spent the remainder of the war up in Scotland training young crews coming through, the vast majority of whom were coming through from Canada at that point in time. And one of the crews that he was training, would have been training at that particular time, so we're talking about the autumn of 1944 by now, were a crew which had just joined the 19 OTU. And at that time, they were learning to fly in Whitleys. I'm just going to share this particular story with you. So on the night of 17th of October, 1944, a Whitley bomber AD-685 took off from the Scottish base on a training flight. Crew on board were Canadian, recently arrived at Kinloss to commence their training, like thousands of other young Canadian men had done before them and indeed would after them. The pilot, Flying Officer Kenneth Reid, was from Alberta. The navigator, Flying Officer Walter Wall, mid-upper gunner. The Alexander Sundstrom and the young air gunner John Dowding, they were all Ontarians. The eldest member of the crew, at the grand old age of 29, was Sergeant Leslie Olmsted. He was from Saskatchewan. The only British member of the crew was 19-year-old Sergeant Ernest Levers from Derbyshire. He was a wireless operator and one of Jack's students at the OTU, because that was Jack's trade. Now, one of the crew, John Dowding, was only 17. He'd lied about his age to enlist. He'd hoped to follow in the illustrious footsteps of his elder brother Harry, who was a squadron leader and Spitfire ace. And he'd actually been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his heroics in 1943. Now, his parents were obviously extremely proud of Harry and wanted John to follow in his footsteps. So they were perhaps influenced by their elder son's successes, and they'd signed John's enlistment papers and provided a letter in support saying that he was actually older than he was, so that he could join up.
Gosh.
And this happened. It wasn't rare. I mean, we covered this when we did Brian Slade's episode and his story a few weeks back there. So he was just 16 when he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force on the 3rd of August 1943. So there's nothing unusual about this crew's training flight that night in their Whitley. It was just a routine training operation, a cross-country exercise down the eastern coast of Scotland and the northern coast of England, followed a regular route taken by the training crews, which is designed, as we've just been talking about, to introduce them to night flying before they moved on to Halifaxes or Lancasters at the heavy conversion unit. But at around 21:45 hours that night, their Whitley was recorded as missing. There was no contact. Now, half an hour or so later, in the midst of a severe thunderstorm, several farmers from around my village, so we've got Mr. Bulmer at Stotfold Farm, Mr. Snowden at Seaton, and Mr. Ford at Slingley, were disturbed by the arrival of police officers who told them that an aircraft was missing and was believed to have come down on their land. So the three farmers and their farmhands were asked to assist in locating the crash, which is no mean feat, obviously, in the dark, and to try and search for survivors.
Yeah.
But the search was in vain. The aircraft was actually found, or the remains of the aircraft was actually found in a field just next to Slingley Farm, which is what, about a mile and a half as the crow flies from where I am now. A subsequent investigation revealed that the aircraft had developed problems over the coast, possibly due to a combination of turbulence and icing. As the pilot had turned to come inland, perhaps in the hope of making a crash landing, the aircraft had begun to break up in mid-air. The exact reason for the disintegration was never firmly established. Control lost in cloud was listed on the accident documents. Fairly frequent flashes of lightning were reported by another Whitley bomber in the area at the time, and the local weather observatory in Durham reported a violent localised electrical storm moving through the area from the west at 9:30 that evening. Perhaps extreme turbulence from the storm had caused this knackered old Whitley to break up. But one thing that really, really stuck with me is that you can't even begin to comprehend the horror experienced by those poor boys on board as it began to disintegrate. As it flew in over the coast of Seaham Harbour, wing fell to the ground by the Georgian public house. Another one just a quarter of a mile or so further on, landing in a backyard. It's a miracle that no one on the ground was killed or injured. 2 engines fell in farmland beyond, and the fuselage containing those poor boys hurtled into the ground in a field, as I've said, just behind Stingley Hill Farm, not too far away from where there's now a disused railway line and cycleway. So there was no fire, no explosion, and the bodies of the crew were found intact, but with horrific impact injuries in and around the upturned fuselage. The bodies of the crew were removed immediately, and they were all buried together, the Canadians were, in the Harrogate Regional Cemetery at Stonefall, where there's lots and lots of Canadian airmen are buried. Sergeant Lever's body was returned to his family in Derbyshire. Now, if you walk along the old railway line now, which, as I say, is a sort of trackway popular with cyclists and dog walkers, you'll pass Slingley Hill Farm on the right, and there's sort of up on the hill, and there's lots of wind turbines next to it. There's no hint as to the events which occurred then, and there's no memorial on that site. But I'll come on to that in a few minutes. Now, young John Dowding, who we talked about, his parents were informed of his death by telegram just 3 days after the crash on the 20th of October. And a second telegram followed 2 days later, informing them that their son's funeral service was to take place at Harrogate the very next day. But by the time the message reached them in Sarnia, Ontario, their child had already been buried. John's commanding officer at Kinloss, Group Captain Cole, wrote to the parents on the 27th of October, relaying details of the funeral service and the circumstances of John's death. And I'll just read what he wrote. As air gunner of his aircraft, he took off on the evening of Tuesday, 17th of October, to carry out a cross-country detail. Contact was maintained with the aircraft until 21:22 hours, which was the last contact made. Information was received later that the aircraft had crashed at approximately 21:30 hours, a few miles inland west of Seaham Harbour near Durham. It may be of some consolation to you to know death must have been instantaneous. The cause of the accident has not yet been established. But I just wondered how many times Group Captain Cole had written the same letter with just the names, circumstances, and dates had been changed. I think 8,240 Canadians were killed on operations with Bomber Command, and 740 died from non-operational causes, the vast majority of those in training accidents. And ironically, this crash actually happened just a couple of miles from Jack, their instructor's home, where his family lived. So anyway, on the 10th of November, finally, I was delighted to attend a small memorial service for this crew, and we unveiled in the village a small memorial plaque It's about, as I say, about a mile and a half away from the crash site. But because that's on private land, you can't actually get to it. So we put it in the village where we thought everyone would see it. And it was a really, really lovely occasion. Everyone in the village turned out, which was lovely. And we had a representative from the Canadian Air Force, Colonel Bouchard, who came up as well. And it's a really, really lovely day, a really lovely occasion. So it's nice that these boys are finally remembered. But the sad thing is that there are just so many other stories like this, so many other crews that had the same fate, basically, in training and never even got to fly operationally. I think it's really important that we remember them just equally in the same way that we remember those crews who actually perished in combat as well.
Yeah. Gosh, that's incredible. I'm quite moved after listening to that. Really, really am, actually.
Yeah. It was a very emotional morning, I must admit. Yeah, when we unveiled that. But I mean, I'd lived here 20 odd years, and I didn't even know about it. And I can literally almost see the crash site from where I live. There was just no information about it. But when I started digging into it, there's quite a few people said, "Oh yeah, my dad remembers when that happened, or my granddad was around, or my grand can remember, or that sort of things." Yeah, it was. And just a couple of miles away, of course, we've got the village of Ryop, where Cyril Barton, VC.
Yes, of course, yeah.
His aircraft. And in the same village on the beach, there was another bomber crash in 1940 from a mine laying crew. But again, nobody knows about that one. But that's one of the stories I'll be telling in the new book. But yeah, anyway, so there we are. A lot to about there.
Yeah, it's Cyril Barton. I remember just very, very quickly when I gave a talk on the Nuremberg raid, I read his letter out when I gave a live talk on it. And that was one that I struggled to hold together. And I remember the person that was hosting, I read the letter out and they told me afterwards, they're going, please don't tell me Cyril died. And then I told the story and they, had a little tear behind the scenes. And this is so powerful, isn't it? When you study this
Yeah. He is very, very, very well remembered, even today, or especially today. There's a beautiful mural on one of the older buildings in that village, which has been unveiled just in the past few years or so. It's fantastic. And there's a new housing estate, which has just in the process of being built, which is called Barton Park after him.
Oh, wonderful.
So, yeah, he's very well remembered indeed. Which is lovely.
And now the Stingley crew as well, which is that's wonderful, incredible. So we do have to move on. I think we're going to go with some viewers' questions. So the first one I've got here is from Jamie McTrusty, regular listener, which was on Blue Sky. I remember seeing a couple of accounts over the years of WAAFs secretly flying as passengers on operations. Are there any documented examples of this actually happening? Jane, I believe you've got something on this.
I have, yeah. I have heard of a few examples of this happening. I couldn't find the particular one that I was looking for, but I did stumble on another one, and this is an accident at RAF Tain up in Scotland, and it's the rescue of a lady called Miss Mary McLean, who was a WAAF wireless operator. I'm going to read this out. It's just a short account. It's in connection with a Liberator bomber which crashed near Helmsdale near the very, very end of the war. And this account was from one of the actual survivors. So in the 1980s, during an inspection of sort of oil pipelines that run across the seabed there up in Scotland, the water cameras had picked up some wreckage of a large 4-engine aircraft. Lots of sort of local people got in contact to say that, there was a story about a Liberator bomber crashing in the sea just off Helmsdale, and there was only one survivor from the crash, and that survivor was a woman. So let me just tell that story.
Wow. Please do, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the story that the lady herself told. So on the night before the accident, Mary and another WAAF decided to visit the chaps in the radio station. On their way to camp, they got lost for several hours and therefore got no evening meal. Going on duty in the morning, missed breakfast too. While Mary was on duty in the control tower as an RT operator during the afternoon, one of the pilots, Harry Lewis from the Royal Canadian Air Force, again Canadian, called in regarding a test flight he was about to make on the Liberator, which had just been serviced. Harry was 32 years old and had been married for 10 years, and his wife had just had a baby boy. Some of the WAAFs were making woolly toys for him, and it was the source of amusement as their toy-making abilities varied considerably. His usual crew was not available, and he was trying to make up a scratch crew, as it wasn't going to be a very long fight, just a short one. He'd asked Mary and her colleague Winifred Hutchinson to come along, both for the trip and to act as wireless operators to check the radios. Now, whether this was actually allowed or not is questionable. I suspect not, but it happened. Their position in the aircraft was behind the pilots. Mary behind the first pilot, Harry Lewis, and Winnie behind the second pilot's seat. After a normal takeoff, the aircraft headed north over the sea towards Helmsdale at a fairly low altitude. It was still heading north when the pilots started checking the engines by feathering the props. There was no advance warning whatever before the port wing dropped and the plane crashed into the sea. Mary found herself in the sea, and her first impression was of absolute silence. She looked around and saw that the plane had broken in two, and the flight engineer, whose name she did not know, was alive in the sea. He said he would go around to the other side of the plane, but as he shouted help, she saw his arm disappear onto the water. At the time of the crash, the Helmsdale fishing fleet was in port with the crews still on board, as they were about an hour late due to a good catch. The fishing boat Joy Lucy Cathy Mackay, skippered by Neil Mackay, obviously named that boat after all of his daughters, had recently had a new engine fitted, and being the fastest was the first on scene, followed by the others. Mary had no sensation of being cold and must have been losing consciousness as she thought the outline of the fishing boat was land and started to swim. She shouted help and lost consciousness. Neil Mackay, a non-swimmer, got a glimpse of the sun shining on her auburn hair just under the surface, jumped out of the boat and hauled her on board. Winnie Hutchinson had also been thrown out of the plane with extensive injuries, but when taken to hospital, she was pronounced dead. Mary spent about a month in hospital being treated for 2 broken legs and concussion, followed by a month spent convalescing before returning to duty at 10. The other 7 members of the crew all died in the crash. So Winifred Hutchinson is buried at Salt Hill Cemetery in Gateshead, not too far away from me. The rest of the crew were not recovered, but there's little doubt that the 4-engine aircraft that was found in the 1980s is that aircraft is their grave. And these are from 53 Squadron. So those gentlemen, let's name them. Let's not forget them. Are Flight Officer H. Lewis, Flight Officer H. Brown, Flight Officer Robertson, Flight Lieutenant T. Atkinson, Wireless Operator Parry, and Flight Sergeant George. And Flight Sergeant George was aged just 19. So yeah, Jamie, short answer, yeah, it did happen. It obviously was a bit of a rarity. But just kind of going off a tangent from that, when I interviewed Bill Bradshaw, the tail gunner on my crew, he told me that there was a guy on their base who was actually an intelligence officer, and he was so old he'd actually fought in the First World War. And they used to call him, young'un, basically because he was so old. An ironic nickname. And he was desperate to go on an operation. And one night they actually took him up. And it did used to happen. It used to happen a lot. Obviously, it's not documented in any of the logbooks because, they're not going to get that far off, are they? Yeah. And I suppose that they worked on the basis that, well, if something had happened, didn't matter anyway because they'll all be dead. And if it didn't, well, they'd be back and nobody would be any the wiser. Yeah, they took him. I don't know which operation it was or where they went, but yeah. So unauthorised personnel flying on raids and on operations was not unheard of. I mean, having said that, you've got accounts of people taking their dogs and God knows what, so.
Yeah. And we wouldn't know, would we? A lot of them, like you say, it wouldn't be documented, so.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So yeah, but I'm sure there's another one where there's a couple of WAAFs killed in an accident where they go up and again, I don't think it's on an operation, but it's they shouldn't have been there and they were taken up and for a bit of a lark kind of thing and it crashed. I will try and dig out the details of that incident, Jamie, as well. So quite an interesting question. Thanks for that, Jamie.
A little bit of a diversion as well, but I seem to remember going to Tangmere as a kid, the museum there, and learning about a WAAF that was sitting on the tail wheel of a Spitfire when it took up. when it took off, and they had to be radioed, and it landed, and she was on the tail and survived unscathed. But can you imagine that? Because you'd sit on the tail to keep the weight down, to keep the tail down if the engine, all this sort of stuff. So yeah, can you imagine that?
God.
Well, they seem to have a diorama of just this WAAF clinging onto the tail of a Spitfire. I don't know if it's still there, but that was a long time ago. I want to look that up now. We're bound to have a listener that's going to say something about that.
Yeah,
but yeah,
I'm going to find out about
yeah.
one. Yeah.
Okay, shall we go to the next question?
Yeah.
Alex Parkey on Blue Sky. How common was it for air crews to volunteer to fly additional ops? Examples, so a sick, injured crew member could finish their tour together very quickly. Yeah, it was common. And you'd want to get your tour over and done with. But what I will say is, crews, there was a lot of superstition over this. If someone went sick and someone stepped in, they saw it as a bad omen because it wasn't part of the crew and they wouldn't all finish together, etc., etc. But yeah, Jane, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, again, going back to episode 3 that we did with Tom Davidson, I remember him saying after they completed their 30, much to their horror, their pilot, Pat, actually volunteered them for another 6 without consulting the crew. So they all thought they were about to finish, and then they found out they were going to have to fly another half dozen. But yeah, so it does happen. You've just said mainly because obviously people want to get their tour over, so they want to get their 30 ops over and done with as quickly as they possibly can. So if the chance comes to go up, they're going to take it, I guess. But also there's the situation where you were kind of voluntold rather than volunteered. Because if the crew's short of a navigator or whatever, and there are no volunteers coming forward, you are just going to be told to you are going.
Yeah, you volunteered.
Yeah, you have volunteered for this particular operation. Yeah, that used to happen all the time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, good question. Thanks, Alex.
I love the questions. We get some good ones, don't we?
Yeah, we've got some others.
With the next one, Ernest Malley, another familiar name. How do UK-based air crews qualify for the Italy campaign stars or the Italy campaign star? Yeah, so there were ops from England to Italy through most of the war. You didn't qualify for an Italy star doing that. You would qualify if you flew between the 11th of July 1943 and the 8th of May 1945 from Italy or the Mediterranean theatre. So that would include Greece and a few other places. So that is how you qualified for it. So not everybody who would have, say, if you were on a raid to Milan in 1943, you wouldn't get an Italian star for doing that. But if you'd have flown after the 11th of July 1943 from Italy or Greece or whatever, you would qualify for it. Or if you were ground crew based there as well. So I think that covers that.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm just thinking about a lot of my mine laying crews who were laying mines in the Danube. They were obviously based in Italy. So yeah, they would have probably qualified for that.
Yeah, because they would have flown for those days.
Yeah, question 4 comes from Jamie Heffy. Hi, Jamie, and thanks for joining us and the other day on the live stream as well. Jamie asks, were fly-ins for Bomber Command common? For example, the ORB from Bircham Newton logs an awful lot of Bomber Command aircraft landing throughout the war, sometimes 1 or 2 after missions and being debriefed there, even though it was a coastal command station. Was it common for Bomber Command aircraft to finish ops elsewhere? Do you want to tackle that?
Oh, absolutely. You think especially if they're damaged or, instruments are packed up, or they don't have enough fuel, they will land at whatever base they can land at. And you actually have bases that are set up particularly for this purpose, especially along the coast, that would have a flare path and a very makeshift sort of setup to support these crews. So the answer is yes, absolutely. It happened, and it happened a lot. Jane, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I was just, again, looking at Jack's logbook, and they used to land all over the place all the time. I mean, after that first stop, when they were only their last stop, they were in such bad condition that they had to, somewhere in Kent, but by memory. But the ORB for that particular op also said that it was very foggy that night, and so the crews returning home were told to disperse anyway and basically just land at other bases throughout the country. But yeah, the main reason would be obviously if you're damaged or particularly if you're short of fuel, you are just going to land at the first possible spot you come to, in English territory, I guess, or Scotland if you're coming back from Norway.
Yeah.
So yeah, all the time.
Absolutely. Next question, Rob Shipman. Why was the Sterling the only British heavy bomber to feature dual controls? I would have thought the redundancy it offers would be a plus in flight if the pilot is incapacitated for any reason. We had a quick chat about this because this isn't one I'm too familiar with. And we've got a couple of theories here, haven't we? I don't know. Do you want to go first, Jane? And then...
Yeah, my theory is that as bombers developed and as operations developed, it was probably normal as time went on for not just the pilot to be able to fly an aircraft on board. So the flight engineer in particular would quite often have had some rudimentary flight training. And also other members of the crew, as happened with my crew, may have trained or had some degree of pilot training and failed it and then gone into other trades or professions. And again, that's exactly what happened to tail gunner Bill Bradshaw. He'd actually gone to Canada to train as a pilot and he'd failed his training. And because he wanted to get into the thick of the action as soon as possible, rather than going through the lengthy navigator's training, he decided he would just become a gunner because the training was only short. So that's what he did. And what would actually happen is that quite often during the course of their flights, the pilot would want to go for a pee and he would radio on the intercom for Bill to come up from the tail turret to take over the flying of the aircraft while he popped off to the loo. And he always gave Bill exactly the same instructions. Just fly it bloody straight and don't know bloody heroics. I mean, literally, it would just be like for a moment, just for a minute. But yeah, so that was what happened. But because Bill knew how to fly, that's what happened. So, yeah, I mean, obviously that's not going to be the case on every aircraft, but I suspect it's because that the flight engineer could potentially step in. And also, of course, on a lot of these ops, you had second pilots because you were taking people up. Sort of their second dicky experience or whatever you call it. So quite often there would be another pilot on board, of course, as well. So anyway, that's just my theory.
Yeah. In fact, there's a great account for the... There's a great account for the Augsburg raid. You got Patrick Doorhill that's flying with John Nettleton in the leading aircraft as a second dicky, and there's some incredible interviews with him. I have a theory, and I don't know. We'll probably get someone saying you're talking rubbish, James, but it's because the Sterling was the only British four-engine bomber. Now, before you go, James, you're absolutely mad. Get off of the podcast. The Lancaster originally was the Avro Manchester, and with the Halifax, it was designed originally with two Rolls-Royce Vulture 24 cylinders. And I'm wondering whether it was something at the design stage at the beginning that they put into the Sterling, then down the line went, actually, we don't need that, or et cetera, or whether it was a design thing because of that. So I'll be interested to know whether that's the case or not. But there we go.
Also, was it an economics proposition, really? Because, I mean, the amount of extra money you're going to have to spend, if you are in the circumstances where your pilot is being hit anyway, well, to be honest, you're going to be in pretty dire straits. To start with. I don't know. Yeah, it's a tricky one. That I don't know what the definitive answer is, though. Can I just point out at this stage as well, right? We get all these questions, some of them are absolutely fantastic and really obscure, and there are absolutely loads we just don't know the answer to. There's so much about Bomber Command that we do not know. In fact, it's a case of the more I learn, the less I know. So, yeah. There'll be people who know the answers to these questions in much more detail than we do. And if you do, please get in touch and expand on them. We'd love to hear from you. Shall we go on to the next one? And that's from Ali Campbell-Grieve. Hi, Ali. How are you? Ali says, was there any retraining or careers advice for the post-war demobilisation of aircrew? How many pilots will be retained or went into commercial flying? He says, rightly, there's probably less call for air gunners in the commercial world, one would hope. But did wartime pilot training automatically give one a civil licence? And that is one of the questions. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that.
No.
With regard to the retraining and careers advice, I know that for the officers, I think it was just for officers, I don't know about the NCOs, there was a scheme in place whereby the RAF would actually pay for the university fees. Because again, Bill our tail gunner, as a prime example, I went to Queen's University Medical School in Belfast in the late 1940s. I mean, he'd been demobbed in 46. He didn't stay in the RAF after the war. His university fees were paid for by the RAF. So
Amazing, wow.
yeah. So whether that was a sort of just in relation to doctors, and it might have been something to do with the formation of the NHS as well or something, I don't know. But
Yeah, that's interesting.
been, or whether it's sort of extended to other degrees and other professions, I'm not sure, but that was certainly the case for him. So he said that if it hadn't been for that, he wouldn't have been able to afford to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow. And I do wonder what the differences. Yeah. Well, I wonder what the differences were between officers and NCOs as well. Whether it was a case that officers got more opportunities, and it was a case of here's a spam sandwich, there's the door for the NCOs, or what? I don't know. That'd be something worth finding out about, I think, actually.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested in that.
Did pilot training automatically give you a civil license? I don't know about that, but I'm quite intrigued to find out. I know at least one 10 Squadron man, Doug Evans, who I had the privilege to meet on several occasions, who was a wonderful man. He was a pilot with 10 Squadron, and he flew commercially for decades after the war. I think he flew, was it Pan Am? He flew anyway.
Oh, wow.
But I don't know what his route into commercial flying actually was, whether he went into it straight after the war, or whether he had a bit of a gap or whatever. But yeah, and obviously many commercial pilots had come through that route in the sort of 50s and 60s.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine a few of them might have had enough of flying at the end of it, wanted to do something absolutely away from it. Which you can't blame them for, can you?
The pilot for Jack's crew, he never ever flew again after the war. Never, just walked away, and that was it. He'd had enough.
Okay, last question. Ian Miles, which aircraft mark had the biggest impact on its introduction, apart from the Lancaster ? Ooh. Can you talk about the Light Night Striking Force, or was that too adjacent? In terms of impact of aircraft, I suppose the Lancaster. Oh, it didn't come without teething problems, of course. The Manchester and even the early Lancasters had teething problems, didn't they?
Well, they
had to be developed. I mean, I imagine. Yeah.
It's checkered past, until they got the Mark III. For those of you who heard me expanding on this on the History Rage podcast, to go into great detail about all the various different marks of Halifax and the horrific problems that they had, right up to the introduction of the Mark III in late 43, early 44. So that's quite the question, actually. What about the shout out for the Mosquito, maybe?
Possibly. I think the Wimpy, the Wellington, was probably pretty good from the off, well designed and such like. I don't recall anything particularly bad. I know with the blending there were issues with the engines and stalling and such like. But like you say, most of the aircraft had something. There were teething problems, the development and such like. But
I think it's difficult to measure. I mean, what do we actually mean by the biggest impact on introduction? Because I think, as we mentioned in the earlier episodes, the bomber force was so small initially. It sort of kind of just grew quite slowly for the first couple of years. That there was no kind of like one big thing, one big development. And in terms of impact, do you mean what in terms of the actual bombing campaign? Because it was rubbish for the first 2 or 3 years, wasn't it? I mean, it was a complete waste of time, basically.
Well,
so it was. Come on. Bongos and banjos, come on, it's true. Yeah.
Battle of the Barges.
Well, go on, I'll give you that. And mineling, obviously.
There wasn't a lot, I will give you that.
Yeah.
But I don't think a total write-off.
Let me put it another way. It didn't make the impact originally hoped for or intended.
No. Which was astronomical when you look at the interwar period, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What the bomber could do and such like. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's time to wrap up, isn't it? We've gone through everything. As usual, a request for family stories, and we're really looking forward to that. That's going to be a fantastic episode. The next episode will be with Luke Turner, followed by Wakeman Bjorn. And we're also going to do a couple on your book as well, I believe. Maybe 1 or 2 episodes. Talk about this development and such like.
News on the book. It says on the publisher's website, 12th of December. But apparently that is not actually a realistic proposition. I've just spoken to them this week, but yeah. So yeah, we'll see. I think it's going to be lucky if it's this side of Christmas, which is very disappointing, but can't be helped. These things just take time.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, I've done my bit, so just have to wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. A big thanks to everyone who's made comments about the cover and who's also pre-ordered as well.
I love that cover.
I'm absolutely off the moon. The cover's fantastic. It is so great. I'm absolutely thrilled with it. Yeah. Anyway, but we're talking about that in a little bit more detail. We might do that, when I've got a firm publication date, I guess.
Yeah.
A bit more sensible, isn't it? Yeah, we'll do that then. Right. Well, we'll wrap it up there then. So thanks so much for listening, everyone. Do leave us a review or a star rating wherever you find your podcasts. It really does make a difference. And for early access to episodes and live streams and question and answer sessions, please do consider becoming a subscriber for as little as £2.40 or $3 a month. The link is in the show notes or at nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. So we'll see you all again soon. Thanks for listening. Bye.